I am from Flint. I'm a Flintstone. And in fact, I played basketball in Flint, but you never heard about that, and there's a good reason for that. Because I didn't do anything after Flint. You know, obviously Flint is in the news today for some very bad things. During the time I grew up in Flint, which was the 50s and 60s, Flint was in its heyday. I mean, Flint was a great place to be. And from my neighborhood in Flint, we had a lot of great things happen. We had a lot of great people come out of that neighborhood. And Rob introduced Reggie Barnett earlier. I want to talk about my buddy, Reggie Barnett, because, you know, we had, again, a lot of people come out of this neighborhood, and these are stories you don't hear anymore today. Reggie was valedictorian of our high school class. I think he had 3.95 or something. But he also let it in. I don't know. He had one or two detractors. I remember that. Reggie lettered also in football, track, and basketball. We played basketball together for the Flint Central, in those days, Indians. You can't do that anymore. But at any rate, then he went to Notre Dame, played for Pasick, won the national championship in 1974, starting defensive back. But then, after a short stint in the NFL, Reggie decided that education was the thing, right? Not playing in the NFL. So he had other options. So he went to Duke, got his MBA and law degree, and had a long career at IBM. Was a senior manager there, senior VP. And so more recently, Reggie started a business in the Detroit area, and he's collaborating with me on this course that I developed at University of Michigan in urban entrepreneurship, and we're planning to take this course to other universities, Wayne State and others. You know, it's great to be back in the area, be back with my buddy, be collaborating, and to be able to tell the stories. We have so many people like this from Flint in those days. And with all the things that have happened lately and the decline of communities like Flint, people lose sight of the fact that when people had jobs, things were pretty good. I actually, and Rob is a great salesman. So he's passing my book around. I wrote a
commission on it.
Yeah, we'll give you. Buy you breakfast.
It's going to be sold afterwards, by the way. Literati's going to come in.
Yeah, Literati bookstores.
Buy some of his copies.
I wrote a book a few years ago about just the experience of starting out as a kid in Flint with a dream of having my own electronics manufacturing company, and realizing that dream to the point where we had a company that sold advanced telecommunications equipment. We designed, manufactured, and sold this equipment in more than 25 countries. And I was fortunate to be able to do that, but Dr. Martin Luther King and the movement that he led enabled that career. So it's a very personal thing for me. In fact, when I had my company, we did this in New Jersey. I went to New Jersey to work for AT&T Bell Laboratories in the 70s. And I started the company there, built the company there. And even before Martin Luther King Day was a national holiday, it was a holiday at my company every year. And some of my employees, most of whom were white and Asian, some of my employees didn't take the day off in those days. And that was fine with me. If you want to work on the holiday, you work. You know, ultimately, the day became a national holiday, and that was a great thing. Again, I did write this book, Proving Ground, to tell the whole story, because, again, I think people lose sight of the fact of some of the great things that happened and came out of this movement. And it's kind of a story about the intersection of race and technology and business. You can reach me later at davidtarver.com, the book, provinggroundbook.com, or here at University of Michigan, W.D. Tarver. I'm teaching a course here, Entrepreneurship 490.012, Urban Entrepreneurship. Rob is kind enough to help me with the leadership portion of that course.
We're passing it around?
Yeah, passing it around. So that's great. So I just want to talk about this era, what happened in this era, and what it did for me, what it meant for me personally, and my peers. So if we could show the first slide. This is my father. My father served in the U.S. Army in World War II, and he was stationed in the Aleutian Islands. He was a radio operator. I guess in those days they needed to communicate with, the folks in the Pacific Theater, and he was up there doing that. He was from Georgia, southern Georgia, Albany, Georgia. Next slide. And in the last few years, I dug out my father's discharge papers from the Army. If you could just click on that. I noticed that, again, he was indeed, according to the story, he was he went to communication school and learned radio technology in the Army. And he received some of the medals that people received in the World War II theater. He was a Army Service Medal, Victory Medal, Atlantic, go back. But before and after he came out of the Army, he was an insurance salesman. And so my father had this love of electronics, and he learned more about electronics and radio while he was in the Army. But due to the time that he came out of the service and what was happening in the country in those days, my father couldn't get a job in the electronics industry. So he sold insurance. He sold insurance for a black-owned insurance company out of Atlanta, Georgia. I can't remember the name of the company offhand. So that was my father's story. You go to the next slide. This is my mother. And I often tell people, you can see where I got my good looks. My mother my mother was born in Flint because her parents had migrated to Flint after World War I, where my grandfather, my mother's father, owned a dry cleaning store across from the entrance to the Buick automobile factory. So he was very enterprising in those days. He knew a lot of guys that were coming out of there dirty, and he was going to clean their clothes. So if you go to the next slide, my mother was a registered nurse, and she got her nursing training at Grady Memorial Hospital. If you click it, one thing you notice, she got her degree from the Grady Colored School of Nursing. Okay, and this is what the situation was like in those days. This was a segregated society. My mother died in 2014, but several years ago we went on a trip to Georgia and we stopped by Grady, and she had a good time talking with the folks there and reminiscing about those days, because even though it was a segregated society at that time, this represented progress. She was a registered nurse, okay? And my folks, because of some bad situations that occurred in Albany, Georgia, mainly for my mother, bottom line is, my mother, at the hospital she worked at, one night had to pee real bad. And so she went to the nearest bathroom, which happened to be a bathroom that was labeled white. And somebody saw her coming out of that bathroom, and she was severely reprimanded. And that's when my folks decided, okay, we're moving up north. And so they moved to Flint. And that's why I was born in Flint. So that's me. 1953. A few years after Rob. I know I look a lot younger than that, but so this is 1953, and I had to look back. This was just before the beginning of the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement in this country, because 1954 is when Brown versus the Board of Education was decided that ended segregation in public schools, right? Public schools was that particular case. But if you go to the next slide, I looked back and see what was happening at that time. This was the Detroit Lions, and the really weird thing about this was Detroit Lions were world champions. I think this might be the last time they won anything. But you notice here that this is an all-white, players, coaches, assistants, everybody, was white. And so if this was the Detroit Lions in 1954, 53, you can only imagine what a corporate boardroom looked like. What the boardroom at IBM, where my buddy Reggie ended up working, what that looked like in 1953. So if we go to the next slide, This is Michigan Wolverines in 1953. Click, please. Hey, progress. You know, we're making progress. I don't know the name of that guy. Maybe Rob remembers. But you know, okay. So, but we were making progress. You know, that's the key. And obviously, if you look at either of those teams today, you see where things have changed. But this was the world in 1953, and this is the world that I was born into and started growing up in. So if you click, there were two huge movements that occurred that I was aware of. There were more movements than two in the 60s, but one of the movements I was aware of was this civil rights movement. And there's Dr. Martin Luther King. I think this is going across the bridge, right, in Selma. What was that, 1965, 64? I don't know, somewhere in there. Early 60s. And these were the images that I saw on the TV screen in those days. And it was tremendously inspiring because, you know, my father by this time had a job at the post office during the day, but by night he worked on radio and TV in the basement. He fixed radios and TVs for people in the neighborhood because he had this love of electronics. And so I inherited that love of electronics. And so I would be in the basement working, I'd come upstairs and watch TV, and I thought, hey, things might be changing. It could be, maybe I can have a career in electronics where my father could not. So this is one of the movements that I saw that gave me hope. Click, please. The other movement was started by these three guys. I always challenge my students, or people I'm speaking to when I show this slide, to ask, you know, do you know who these folks are? Anybody want to venture a guess as to who these folks are?
McNamara?
Excuse me?
McNamara? No.
I'll give you a hint. They're at Bell Labs. So these are the guys who invented the transistor, and they are looking at their invention. Transistor, William Shockley, John Bardeen, Walter Batten, they invented the transistor, and the transistor is the thing that enabled us to be carrying, you know, this stuff around. Because in the Apple, say, A7 phone chip, there's like 1.5 billion transistors. You couldn't do something like this with a vacuum tube, which was you know, prevalent before the transistor, but the transistor enabled you to get smaller and smaller and smaller geometries, and so, you know, I think this is the 6, Apple 6, right? So this probably has 2 billion transistors. It's crazy. So I was aware of this movement because of my father. My father in the 60s was bringing home books about transistors and lasers and all kinds of crazy stuff that, you know, people in my neighborhood thought, you know, some weird stuff going on in Tarver household. But, you know, that's what I grew up with. So next slide, please. So in high school, all 4 years of high school, I was a finalist in the Flint Science Fair. And my projects always had something to do with electronics. So senior year, my project was testing the effects of gamma radiation on the characteristic curves of transistors. And I used the gamma radiation cobalt source here at the University of Michigan. That was my first acquaintance with the University of Michigan to do that project. Next slide. So in the 70s, I was able to come here to the University of Michigan. My father couldn't have dreamed of going to engineering school at the University of Michigan.
You had a lot of hair then.
I had a lot more hair. I had some cool clothes. I think you still got a shirt like that. You know, we dressed funny in the 70s, but we had a good time. You know, but before this, I went to General Motors Institute for 2 years. That's where I started my education. Kettering University now, transferred here as a junior, and had got a great education in electronics, electrical engineering, communication theory here at the University of Michigan. So you go next slide. So lo and behold, after college, I get a job at the place that every electrical engineer wanted to work. Well, the ones that didn't want to work at IBM. I got a job at Bell Labs. place where a transistor was invented, doing the development of telecommunications test instruments that would enable better and better data communication. Click, please. So after 7 years at Bell Labs, I convinced two of my buddies, who were also working at Bell Labs, to come in the basement with me at my house. That's my house behind us. To come in the basement and start this company. I had an idea that we could develop some instrumentation that would enable the development of better data communications equipment. So they joined me in the basement. For 2 years, we worked on a prototype of this first project. This is Steve Moore, one of my co-founders, Charles Simmons, and that's me on the right with my Ulrich's t-shirt on. Next slide. So we started this business in the basement. After a year or so, we came out of the basement. We started hiring people. And after a year or so, we started getting some traction. We were fairly successful. Next slide. So we grew this business. Our first big export market was Japan. And this is a picture from my first visit to Japan in 1987, where we were getting our products into that marketplace to companies like Sony and Matsushita and Ricoh and others. So we had a great time. But you know, again, going over there, I wasn't sure how would I be received as a young black owner of a small company, going to Japan and trying to sell to these titans of industry. And I was surprised to learn that my pedigree, in terms of being from Bell Labs, was more important than my persona. And these folks bought our products. Some months we sold more product in Japan than we sold in the US. Next slide. So again, we were able to fortunately develop this telecommunications company where we sold in more than 25 countries, advanced telecommunications equipment, first starting with systems for testing for testing analog modems, if any of you are old enough to remember that, and then testing wireless devices like cell phones and simulating the propagation environment that these devices experience. Next slide. So, I come back to Michigan in 2007. I sold my company in 1995. I stayed under contract until 2000. When the contract was up, I left. I fooled around in New Jersey for a few years, started a not-for-profit company out there. But my sister passed away in 2005. So in 2007, I decided to move back to New Jersey because my mother and my sister were very close. My mother was up in the Flint area, and so I wanted to be closer to her and to just come back home. And this is what I saw when I came back home. This is very different from the Flint and from the Michigan that I left in 1976. Next slide. So I got involved here at the University of Michigan teaching entrepreneurship, and I recognized that there's a lot of resources, intellect, brain power that we have here in places like University of Michigan, but I worry that, you know, if we have all this brain power, why do we have these pictures like we see in Flint and Detroit? Why is it not being applied to the problems that people are experiencing in these communities? So in 2014, I started an organization called Urban Entrepreneurship Initiative. We've done a couple of symposiums, 2014, 2015. And so what we are trying to focus people on is the fact that we have these urban problems means that we have opportunities, and not only opportunities to advance people's lives, but opportunities to make money for entrepreneurs. And you can see some examples of, you know, how people are doing this today. We think that Uber is solving an urban problem. You know, this whole drone delivery thing with Amazon, that's solving an urban problem. There are lots of technologies that we can apply to solve the problems that exist in the world. So that's kind of where I am today. But none of this would have been possible employing the people that we employed in New Jersey, coming back here and teaching students, starting this organization that's aiming to reinvigorate communities. None of that would have been possible without the movement that Dr. Martin Luther King started. So that's what he means to me. Thank you very much.